Welcome to Education Talks. I'm David Burke. Today's guest is Andrew Mowat. Andrew is an education journeyman, educator, principal, author, expert trainer and coach. Now, amongst other projects, he's the co-founder of EduSpark.World. It was a real honour to speak with Andrew in this first episode of Education Talks. Andrew Mowat, welcome to Education Talks.
Thanks, Dave. Great to be connected. We've had some great chats. Finally, it's good to record one between us.
Absolutely. Now, where in the world are you right now?
I'm in Singapore, and as of next week, it'll be my 10-year anniversary in living in Singapore. I love the place. It's a really good part of the world, mostly. You might hear the only problem we get from time to time, I'm close to one of the airports, and we might be buzzed during the interview with the odd F-15 or so. It's like living in an air show. But apart from that, it's just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, great place to be, somewhere where I called home for a couple of years. Now, if Singapore's been home for 10 years, where are you from originally?
Originally born at a very early age, in Newcastle, so a little bit similar to your original stamping ground. But most of my career was in Victoria. So I moved to Melbourne as a young lad, 8-year-old, and hence you'd probably call me Victorian because I've got an AFL football team, not an NRL rugby team as what I follow. So probably pretty well Victorian from that point of view, Melbourne.
Yeah. Yes, you're on the traders list, that's for sure.
Yes. Yeah.
So then you began your teaching career in Victoria, in Melbourne?
Yeah, I actually began it before I finished my degree. I was doing a science degree, always interested in the sciences. Not brilliant at maths, and I would have loved to have been in the whole weather and meteorology type world, but the physics was too hard for me. And I was still interested in the natural world a hell of a lot, still am. And so I flipped over to do ecology and ethology and even some animal behaviour type studies. And it was during that I remember seeing some stats that the number of science degree graduates getting jobs was pretty low. And about the same time, I had begun to teach instrumental music, and I was enjoying the teaching game. So I flipped into a science education course, and then the rest is sort of history. And my first year of teaching, Trivial Pursuit question, you might know the answer to this one. My first year of teaching was the same year that Mac was first released to the market. So what year do you reckon that might be?
Was that? Oh, gee, I should know as a bit of an Apple.
Yeah.
What
Very
year was
famous
that?
ad. Very famous ad with a lady with a sledgehammer coming down through all the IBM.
Oh, that was 1984.
Correct. Yeah. So 1984. I think that's probably what, if you like, bit like some sort of viral infection of my teaching DNA. I was lucky enough to have 3 Macs in the back of my room in this small country town up in the northwest, 5 hours northwest of Melbourne, a little place called Rainbow. Still have some great friends and still in touch with some of my first students from that era. So at that stage, we're only 4 or 5 years younger than me at that point, so it was a really interesting period of my career. But that whole approach to having those computers in my classroom at that early stage of my career probably took me down a bit of an ICT route, a bit of an ed tech route.
Absolutely. So then, you were in Rainbow in Victoria. So how long were you there?
I was there for 3 years, and then I moved into the eastern part of Victoria, got involved with a couple of schools in the Mowat area, including, I'm a real journeyman. I spent some time running a network of all things. It was an old BBC network with a massive 50 megabyte hard drive that took 5 minutes to start up, and you couldn't start any computers up, but basically a lab back very early in the day when we're talking about 1987 or so down at Churchill. And most people probably haven't heard of BBC as a computer brand, but it was a bit of an Apple II type sort of box, if you like. And ultimately moved from that to running a multi-campus sort of ICT type leadership role, which was basically 4 periods allowance for Kernigh College. And from there became, if you like, a bit of an EdTech lead, even though it wasn't called EdTech back then, for a Greenfields Aboriginal school called the Koori Open Door Education Initiative, and Morwell was one of the ones that I was based in. So I started to do quite a bit of work involving some disenfranchised parts of the Australian community, the Aboriginal community, in better education using technology. But strangely, I jumped from being in the secondary world from that role into running a primary school. So I went from sort of this greenfield startup career open education school into being principal of Druin Primary School. So a bit of an unusual sort of pinball-like, if you like, bouncing from one thing to the other type career. But I think a lot of people have that journeyman approach to their career over time.
So when you made that transition from sort of an ed tech person and then moved into that sort of leadership role, is that when your passion and I guess background interest in metacognition sort of started to become more prominent?
Yeah, a good question. Actually, no. It was shortly after that role. I took a break. It was a very stressful set of circumstances, and I decided to step out of education at that point and began a coaching career. And I just so happened to do that with what was then called Results Coaching Systems, later to become the Neuro Leadership Institute, run by David Rock, who now has a number of really successful books. And that was a brain-based approach to coaching. And I just fell into coaching. I loved it. I discovered what I'd been doing badly but natively without any structure. But it introduced me or reintroduced me to this idea of taking the brain into account when we engage and intervene and try and connect people to growth opportunities. And that's probably what started that new cascade. I'd always been interested in the brain as a biology teacher. It's just this weird thing in our skulls that is beyond fascinating. Less known about the brain than we know about the universe, in fact. Still, it's a part of the very edge of our science knowledge and understanding. So that's what started me back in this space. And thinking, I remember thinking this idea that, heck, here we are in education, we're trying to affect the brain, as in that's the organ that we're trying to really work on. Yet most teachers know very little about the brain and don't even think about learning as something that is physiologically and biologically changing in the brain. And it was that thought that cascaded into this sort of lifelong passion in let's learn more so that we can inform our craft of teaching, so that we can optimize teaching to better suit what we know about the brain. So it was really that brain-based coaching opportunity that triggered all of that. I think it was probably there in the background, but it's what it brought it to focus and into my sort of putting me on the passion box, if you like, standing up, shouting to the world about we need to know more about this.
What time period was this?
So this was 2006 now. So I was principal for 1999 into 2005, and then left during 2005. And I did that coaching program in 2005. And it led to quite a number of, one of the things I like to do, I don't know if it's a part of my coaching heritage or just the way my brain works, but I like to reduce the complexity of lots of detail into a headline, which is a very coachy thing to do. And I like to do that with science, I discovered. And so therefore, some of the science was telling me this idea that there are mind states and brain states that are predisposed towards engagement. And then there are threat-based systems that are activated when we get the wrong part of the brain working. And that led me to the conceptualization of this idea of the blue zone, red zone being that sort of spiky threat-based or fear-based or anger-based response, which is not very conducive to growth and development, very good for survival. And then this sort of more prefrontal cortex type activity, which is much more considered, balcony and the dance floor type approach of having this meta-awareness of my own state and whether that's useful or not, and using that to understand what better teachers or the best teachers, how they were engaging students and why some other teachers weren't, which led to a book called The Success Zone. Itself, not a massively successful book, but a book nonetheless, in collaboration with some other guys that I'd started to do work with, John Corrigan amongst those, in a group that was going to schools and training middle leaders in the art of coaching to better inform them about leadership. So that period from 2005, 6 through to 2011 was about the period that I took through that journey of understanding that deep connection to conversation, leadership, and the brain.
What's been, I guess, a change in that area throughout that time, like the way that schools or teachers have been perhaps more or less responsive or open to this sort of thing?
It's still a slow journey. I'm still in touch with John more than Doug, my other partner there, but John is still on this search for and still working in this field of investigating why it is that some teachers command exceptional outcomes for students and other teachers are average to less than average. And I think the world of education in some parts of the world, not so much where I am, interestingly, but are interested in the softer sciences. They're not soft at all, but the softer sciences as an element of deep learning. And you would probably know yourself that the times you've learned the most are when you're in the presence of someone who has a really deep and supportive relationship in a learning sense with you, and that's also connected to generative conversation with this person. And unfortunately, with the world the way it is, with our obsession with content, I'm sort of almost beginning to rail against content. We just think of content, adult learning and child learning, curriculum, concept, all these things. We've got to get through the workbook. We've got to get through chapter 3 before this end of time. All of that precludes the rich opportunity that sits in knowing people well and knowing what they need as individuals and being present with them in the dialogue of learning. So I think there are parts of the world where that's becoming, there's a bigger and stronger appetite as people explore why is it that this teacher here on my left just creates outstanding results and the students love them and will do more for the teacher than the kids will do for themselves. And there are other teachers who just plow through the curriculum. And there are these sort of hidden differences that people are starting to surface and highlight. So it's growing, but it's slow.
It actually reminds me of a guy I used to work with in the early part of my career in a country school in New South Wales, and we're sitting in the staff room. And I remember once, it was kind of like there was a little man table where there's a few of us male teachers sitting together, and just having a chat. And I remember one day him just sort of just all this wisdom coming forth, and he was talking about the craft of teaching. He was talking about how one of the things that we don't focus on is that craft of teaching, that people who have that ability to connect with the students will always get better outcomes. And he was someone who was at the end of his career, and looking back, I think of him as someone who was very popular with the students and parents. They all wanted him to teach their kids. But that craft of teaching, it's very important, isn't it?
It is. And what you point out is that sense of unconscious competence, and there's a layer above that where people have to learn why it is that they're so good and why it is that you are getting brilliant results. And all I see from my perspective is you doing the same things, because my frame of reference is through what you do, not who you are. And it's these people who, as you said, connect, listen. It's like coaching. Those of the people who are in the listening audience now who have had coaching and an outstanding coach know that these are people who suspend their own needs in the moment to allow for the reflection, the clarity, and the insight to occur in the brain of the other person. That requires stepping back from your normal everyday needs of having a participatory 50-50 conversation, even more dominant in a classroom where the teacher is delivering all of the time. And that's maybe a bit of an older view of some of the pedagogy, and it has moved on in terms of inquiry-based learning and all of those fabulous approaches which get more at this, but that's still that sense of being there for someone and being unconditional. These are not visible to most people, and so therefore they're confused as to why Dave's so much better than me. I can't see what makes him great. It's frustrating for some people. And these sorts of teachers tend not to have discipline problems as many as other teachers, and they're much more relaxed and at ease with themselves. They don't seem to have as much stress. not to oversimplify things, because teaching is a massively complex career to embark upon, and there is never the time when you know it all. It's like many careers, I'm sure, but it's just such a complex set of circumstances in which you've got a complex series of roles that you've got and skills, and it takes a long time to craft and develop those. But nonetheless, maybe we should be focusing more on these connection engagement, dare I say it, listening skills, which is one of the core skills here. Then I think maybe if we don't do that, we'll be still making that mistake of being focused and on what I've got to teach rather than to whom and how and what how that might be of best value for them.
So, advice to young teachers, for any young people out there listening who are starting their careers as teachers, like what would be the most important thing you'd want to, I guess, get them to think about?
Look, there are so many answers that you can say I'm stopping to think. And there is so much to bring on in the first year or two. It's almost over. In fact, it is overwhelming, from the challenges in a classroom, motivating and managing behaviours, through to the struggle of getting through and planning and delivering, finding your own style, all of these things. I think the number one thing I'd say, first of all, is give yourself time and give yourself permission to navigate your way through this path. Interestingly, in terms of rapid growth, the neuroscience would say we need about 80 to 85%. This is quoting a guy called Andrew Huberman, about 85% success and 15% failure is the ideal ratio, where even modeling machine-based learning on this human learning approach, that 15% will shape the other 85% in the future. And so therefore be comfortable with seeking help, with saying to those around you, if you're in a great school, you'll be supported, but being open to saying, I'm really struggling with this. Ask questions, observe and watch, and just spend the first year, 2 years, 3 years finding your operational feet. But then as you're working your way through, feel okay with things not working. Have a disastrous lesson from time to time. Us older teachers still have disastrous lessons from time to time. And that's that discomfort, that disappointment, the confusion, the lack of confidence are absolutely necessary for learning. That's again calling out Andrew Huberman. He's got a brilliant podcast called the Huberman Lab. And I've learnt so much from him and his approach around the whole idea of metacognition. But go below the line in terms of positive and negative emotions. Be okay with not being 100% happy with how things are, but take forward action. Lean into the strategies, the steps, the tactics you can take to address the mistake. So when things go awry, acknowledge, plan, redo. It's that sort of iterative learning loop. So I think that number one message in amongst all of that detail is just be okay to travel that journey. And sometimes it might feel like 50 or 60% of the things are going wrong. But find your mentor friends that can help you, whether it be remote and asynchronous in something on Twitter, or people within your school and who can support you. It's relationships that support us through those negative valence areas where the grind happens. And when you emerge through that, the self-satisfaction of having survived and built upon that will craft you as an outstanding teacher. Is that too much?
No, I think that's excellent. So I think just to zero in on that 85%, 15% sort of failure rate, success versus failure, like, is that something that you think has perhaps been a little bit forgotten?
It is in a number of ways. We are phobic, anywhere from uncomfortable to phobic with things that are negative. We run away from conflict. We avoid it. And in fact, that avoiding these things is way more damaging. Teachers often try and make the learning as safe and as comfortable for all the right reasons and for all the right motivations. But actually removing those moments where mistakes can't be made, or that they're reduced, or that they're punished even in older systems of education. This aversion to making a mistake is throughout our current modern culture. And I think that's because education has tuned people into making mistakes. You must avoid making a mistake, and that translates into our own practice. Both Craig, EduSpark co-founder of mine, a fabulous friend, both he and I had moments last week in our work independently that were not so much mistakes, but were uncomfortable moments. In fact, I made a mistake in something that I posted last week and only saw the mistake I made, and it wasn't a spelling mistake. And I was uncomfortable with that. But that taught me so much more. So it's that sense of being okay with it is really important. And it is absolutely necessary. The dip in the learning, going from knowing to not knowing, to calling out one of EduSpark's creators, Marcella Sterikoff, who has a book called The Joy of Not Knowing. He often talks to kids about how do you go from not knowing to knowing, and illuminating that path so it's obvious to them is a part of that metacognitive approach. And we need to be in that same space where we need to be aware, sometimes having critical friends that can bring that awareness to us, aware, open and vulnerable. There's a quote that I'll finish this little sort of piece on, that there's a YouTuber called Veritasium. His first name is Derek, his real name. But if you look up Veritasium on YouTube, one of his famous videos is The Science of Learning. And it's a really fascinating 10-minute video, which one of my favorite. But he finishes this with this really elegant line: if you always use the GPS, you'll never learn the way. And as a metaphor, it's absolutely true. It's only when you try not to use technology-assisted navigation, your own brain, and when you get lost and then you find your way again, that you remember that path much more powerfully. And that's a fabulous metaphor or analogy for what learning is. There are times where I've had the GPS going so many times to go to the same place that for some reason I can't access it. The satellites aren't working, or the phone's got a bit of a bug. And all of a sudden think, I can't think of how to get there, because I've always relied. And sometimes teachers become the GPS for their students. So we've got to create those situations where the path is difficult, where you turn the wrong way. And it's that creates the deeper moments of lasting learning that really help people through some big moments later on in their life.
Now, speaking of that, I remember the first time that I listened to you speak. I was actually I was driving in my car in Korea. I remember just before I got in the car, I got a notification on my phone about a webinar that I'd signed up to listen to. So I plugged that in and had that playing in the car as I was driving out to a very nice big mall where I lived in South Korea. And I remember when I arrived at the car park, and I actually sat and continued listening, because you were talking about transfer. You're talking about that idea of that, creating that ongoing piece of learning, and this is a huge driving force for EduSpark.
Yeah, it is, and I continue to learn tremendously. One of the things that is a complete surprise for me is that with the 300 plus potential course creators and thought leaders, trainers, authors that I've had the pleasure and the privilege to speak to over the last 15, 16 months, that has the constant conversation in this space has taught me so much. And I've been able to finesse this down to a couple of key points, and I've alluded to them already. Whoever talks the most learns the most. It's that simple. So how do we create the conditions where the learners in a learning opportunity program, course or whatever, how can they get at more talking opportunity? Because in the talking, what's going on is meaning making of the content, or meaning making of my application of the content. So that sort of calls out another idea that in fact there are three sources of learning. One is the content itself. The second is the action I take and the things I do with it, whether it's I make an artifact, or I create something, or I go and do something. And then the third is that I come and talk to someone about it. Now, a good little example is I've got a beautiful Chinese wife, and I'm learning Chinese. She's learning English. It's how we met. And my English learning is much slower than her English learning, interestingly. But if I see on TikTok an interesting phrase that I think, I'll try that on Susu when she comes home. I've watched it on TikTok. I've consumed it. if I do nothing else, by the time she comes home later in the day, I have completely forgotten what that was. It hasn't stuck. So consumption and content alone does not equal learning. I think learning has to take those further two steps. Go and do something with it. So maybe I repeat it several times. And even then, it's only in the heat of the moment of making a mistake and the stakes are higher that I think I'll really learn a lot. But then it's the laughing and the correction and the conversation that follows that ties that through. So conversation is key. Whoever talks the most learns the most. And then the second piece that drives towards this transfer is the formation of relationships that I mentioned before that take people through that negative part of the journey, the grind, the confusion. And that's where, if you think about it, I've done this myself. I've started a lot of online courses and I haven't finished many of them. And that's that single consumption asynchronous model. There's no relationship established in that asynchronous model. Yet if I'm doing this with, say, with you, there's a peer-based relationship. And over time, if I'm connecting with either synchronously or asynchronously with the leader of learning, then there's a vertical relationship that will sustain me longer through that sort of grind phase of the learning to get me to the point where my mastery becomes evident and I start taking the steps up above that sort of negative above the line, if that makes sense. So for me, the motivation behind EduSpark early on was to do something different. And I don't even know at that early stage when Craig and I first sort of had the idea over coffee and then we started to implement it. I don't think we knew the depth of that desire to get at different professional learning and transfer. So for me, without relationships and without the learner talking, there is no transfer. And there are lots of other things that support it. But that's really, at the end of the day, the technology we're building. It's taken us a while. Very early on, we were almost completely asynchronous, even up until recent times. Now we have live video. Now we have asynchronous communities. So the opportunity for conversation is now technically present. It's up to us to try and build a culture and a community of practice that uses that.
And just for the benefit of listeners who might not be aware of EduSpark, EduSpark.World, professional learning platform, building something that's more than just that, isn't it, Andrew?
It is. It's an ecosystem that's growing. So we're adding new features to it. One feature that's coming soon is the teacher portfolio that allows you to collect evidence, keep it in a repository, if you like, and share it with peers, share it with the facilitator of learning, share it with the line management in terms of evidence for appraisal. So that's an important piece that's coming. But we're driving to all the time finding better ways with our creator community to inform them about adult learning practice in this world of largely asynchronous or online learning, but then also to support face-to-face as well. So it's turned into sort of these two camps, and it's almost a little bit, if you like, Airbnb, where a marketplace type setup has turned up, where we've got access to 300 people, about half of whom are building or have built courses, a bunch of schools on the other side. And so one game we're playing is to improve the capacity for schools to deliver professional learning in a strategic and targeted way at scale in their organisation. So that means being able to target the right course to the right person. And that's not yet fully finished, but that's the journey we're on there. Individual landing pages for institutions that give them a more personalised approach. That connection of the teacher portfolio and into the appraisal process. Certifications are well under their way as an example of helping out schools and teachers. CPD UK are in the middle of quite a number of the certification of our courses. So that ecosystem on the consumption side is growing well beyond what we expected. But then on the creator side, we've got teachers. One of the big problems in starting a career outside as a consultant, as some sort of practice owner, as a thought leader, a trainer, an author, coach, all of these things require significant risk. You step away from your paid role. Your paid role has both a floor of an income and a ceiling of an income. And then you step out into this space and you're experiencing this yourself. Both the floor and the ceiling disappear. So, upwards it's relatively limitless compared to the caps on your salary before, but downwards, that's relatively limitless too. And there's a whole raft of people who in schools who have such value to bring to the world, where it's evident to me now that we can produce a pathway to enable them to start producing and learning how to produce the value in a form that's consumable as learning opportunity for education and schools around the world. There's a pathway to go through from where you are in school, build an audience that loves your work and wants more of what you do, to stepping out and then running a practice of some sort. And we're building components of EduSpark to support that side of the game too. And that to me is completely surprising, so that creators can have a significant profile and, if you like, sell their courses into schools as required. It's one of those things in education that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, this idea that it's actually not morally correct to make money out of education as a thought leader. And that's not entirely true. If you look at that, why not? You've got to survive in this world. And if you survive by bringing tremendous value to other people at scale, and ultimately kids in classrooms, then my belief, and it's been informed by a bunch of people from Australia called Thought Leaders and the Thought Leaders Business School in Australia, that's entirely deserving that you go and get rewarded financially for the work and the value you bring. The thing is to bring value first and then chase. It's not about chasing the dollars first. It's about bringing that value. So another example of a conversation that's gone full circle. But yeah, that's what we're finding in EduSpark. It's becoming an ecosystem rather than a course repository.
I think it also offers something which international schools need, which is a sort of greater connection. Because one of the things I noticed, moving from New South Wales public schools, which are a very big, centralised, huge employer of teachers, and as a result, there's a lot of very smart people who get seconded to work together and to work across regions and to deliver a lot of professional learning. In international schools, sort of becomes a little bit like little islands. So in a way, that you're creating that service as well, which of course is a great benefit to schools.
It's an observation that actually is far more universal than we realise. The world of education is very disaggregated. So yes, we're creating a mechanism where individuals and schools can connect as a silo, and to break that down and connect to other schools or other teachers horizontally in similar roles in other schools. The same is for the thought leadership space. There are so many people running their own battles all the time as someone who's trying to bring value to the world, more or less successful. Some people are brilliantly successful. A lot aren't, because it's a real grind. And when you are acting independently, you're forced to move into a marketing type game as a creator, where you're waving the flag and saying, me too, here, I've got some stuff of value. And that's not what educators really enjoy by and large. So this world of disaggregation is something else that we're trying to address within the context and the game of professional learning. One of the big things now that communities have just dropped in EduSpark, there are 5 I'm in the middle of constructing, with the idea that these are not linked commercially necessarily to needing to have a subscription in EduSpark, but start to address some global needs. I think middle leadership is one. There's not really a great place for middle leaders to learn their craft and hang out together. Women in leadership, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, early career and pre-service teachers, you called that one out before. And there are a couple of others that might sort of merge into that space, where we can create a place for people to hang out and discuss things asynchronously that have close and intimate access to learning opportunities in the rest of the platform. So for me, this building of the horizontal links as much as the vertical links between schools. But then we talk about one other level of disaggregation that will be in every school. That's been in every school that I've visited or known, and that's between the educators and the non-educators in the school. There's a gulf between, as head of IT at the Australian school, my staff didn't get much. My IT support staff didn't get anywhere near the same level of access to professional learning funding, and in fact funded a good deal of their own certification themselves. So treated as almost not the same value as the other parts of the school where professional learning was expected to be a part of the professional game. So desegregation left, right and centre. We're isolated too much in schools and between schools, for sure.
So I guess let's just wind it back a little bit. When EduSpark began, and then how the COVID pandemic impacted the development of EduSpark. How did that play out? So when did you and Craig start to kick around the idea?
So the history is actually mid to post-pandemic, actually, not the start. But I've been, a lot of my practice, I was in a practice at the start. I made this wonderful move in my career from being a head of learning development for Cognita into running my own practice. The absolutely brilliant foresight of doing that in September 2019, and by January, it was COVID, and most of the programs that I was continuing a lot of my work with Cognita as a consultant back in, and of course a lot of that stopped, and a lot of consultants like myself in the world had that big hiatus where in fact no one was booking anything. But I learned a tremendous amount during that particular time. Into 2021, I started to get back on the bike in terms of delivery. And one of the things that Craig and I were beginning to collaborate around, and we go back a number of years. He was a victim of mine in a middle leadership program I ran in 2016. And we connected really well there. And we always knew I'd catch up with a coffee at Stanford American where he was. And quite often we'd we always had generative conversations, and we'd sort of speculate that somehow we'll end up doing something together in the future. We didn't know what, but sort of had that sense that this would be of value. Now, fast forward into the latter part of 2021, Craig had formed a collaborative group of consultants and was beginning to use that expertise amongst some different business opportunities. And I had begun to deliver some work through a platform called LearnWorlds in my work in response to what COVID was doing to the world of professional learning. And we started to together collaborate around delivering EdTech-based professional learning to IT support. As I said before, these are disenfranchised people. So how do we raise their value and their game, bring them into the idea of understanding what the game of education is, and how we can help them feel more connected to the work that they've got. So we ran a couple of pilot programs, and it was in the middle of reviewing that Craig said to me, why don't we build our own? And I sort of cringed to begin with, because one of the characteristics of my career is that it's learning management systems or these sorts of platforms have followed me around. I've implemented 3. I came to Singapore on the basis of being an expert in one of those. I've deployed 2 at scale for Cognita, more or less successful because it's a commerce-based or business-based platform, not an education one. So we knew there was a gap there. There was something that wasn't being delivered to schools. The big commercial ones, the business-based LMSs, are all about compliance. Let's see who's done this and tick this off and how long did they spend doing it. Nothing really about transfer or change. And then there are a bunch of good platforms like Teachable, Thinkific, LearnWorlds that have got good learning tools, but a lot of their processes around marketing as an individual, your course to the world. And so again, it didn't really tie in with the ethos and the approach, and didn't allow us to bring into scale the opportunity that was there by acting as a marketplace for thought leaders, creators, authors, trainers, often who are really chasing that longer relationship with people as their learners. So that's really how it all started. So February 2021, and by April 22nd, I can still remember the day, we said to each other, confirm, let's press the go button. We are partnered with a group in the Maldives, and work started on the 1st of May for building this out. And end of August, we released our very first early version with, I just said, one of my big learnings is it takes a long time for stuff to be developed, much longer than my ADHD brain, I'm sure it's ADHD, but much longer than my impatience would allow for. So Communities was planned to be out on release, and here we are a year later, and we've just released that one after a couple of goes at it. So, so yeah, it's a short history, but the concept continually gets tested in conversation, and we went to thought leaders and to see if they would be happy to build a course for us well before we had anything to show them. I felt like such a scam. This idea of it's going to look like this and it'll look a little bit like that one. We had nothing to show, all smoke and mirrors. But universally, people said this is what we need. This is what education needs.
And it's a focus on the content, really, isn't it? That's the greatest strength of EduSpark. And you've been, speaking of content, you've been just starting some YouTube videos on the EduSpark.World YouTube channel. Looking very good. We might include the link in this, even though this is a brand new channel here, and it's probably not exactly going to send a huge number of people to you, but you never know.
It will eventually, for sure. Particularly after the people you'll interview after me, I'd have to say. But
I wanted to ask you. You actually do some good content with your video creation skills, and I think I've heard you mention before the product that you use, the platform. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm using it right now. So this is not my house. I'm in a fairly small setup in HDB land in northeastern Singapore. HDB is the public housing, and public housing in Singapore is fabulous. It's condo-esque, if that makes sense. So I'm always searching for mechanisms in EdTech. I think EdTech has a special role to play in learning. One of them is in terms of managing attention, because attention is the currency of learning. And if we can hold people's attention and reduce distraction, there's a really good theory that people should be aware of as educators called cognitive load theory. And if we have attention bleeding away to things that are not helping the brain attend to the cognitive work that has to be done, then that distracts. And sometimes putting a visual on a different part of the screen and having a talking head on the other side creates cognitive load, cognitive dissonance, where your eyesight is, and in fact, your eye line and where your eyes go to really is a driver of what your attention is doing. So I think EdTech has a part to play in both triggering and maintaining attention for the length of engagement that a message might take to deliver. And this is one of the ones. It has a particularly good green screen background. I'm continually looking to craft that more so that, for instance, people aren't distracted by little artifacts that appear on the screen. If something goes a bit blotchy or a bit of a green thing, or your hair's got marching ants around it, sometimes people notice these things and don't hear the message. So for me, Phil Libben, who is the founder of Evernote, it's not so popular anymore, but that was really massive, 5 to 10 years back. When he was bought out, he started the platform, mmhmm.app is the address. And I use it in a lot of my learning content because I can be innovative in the way that where I am on the screen in relation to a model I might be using can really hold the attention of the learner. Slightly novel, but not sort of naff or sort of too much, if that makes sense, in the right place on the screen so that the attention is held for longer.
Certainly sounds like a great tool. And if it's okay with you, we might even just record a separate little demo, if that's okay. Just a little quick walkthrough of that. We'll include the link in this description as well, so people can find that. Great EdTech tool. Now, just before we finish up, Andrew, I wanted to ask you, because I know that your daughter is becoming a teacher. This is something which I've noticed. Now, I'm the first generation of, I guess, teacher in my family. In fact, I was the first generation to go to university. Now, it's a bit of a thing now in Australia, isn't it? Teachers' kids tend to become teachers. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, and I think it's even more universal than that. It's a pattern I've noticed that, football players, their kids, either gender now, go on to play football now that we've got better gender equity in the world of professional football sport here in Australia. I see a lot of, I think somehow the passion and the interest and the environment to which kids are exposed to when they're growing up. And teachers, of course, pretty well nearly all teachers have had marking at home, nighttime and on the weekend, and there's that sort of culture of education, even the desire to want to make a difference. I think teachers universally are driven by, certainly the pay hasn't been great enough to pay to be a motivation. It's that sense of, I want to contribute to the growth of other people in some way. And that, I think, as a value flows through to kids. Steph, as a young person, did a naturopathy course. Again, that sort of that value of wanting to make a difference to the well-being and the health of others. Her fiance is a middle leader, a very successful design technology, materials technology teacher in Melbourne. And the fact that her uncle, her aunt, and myself are all in education, she's been surrounded by educators all of her life. Now, interestingly, my own parents were not educators. So, but the strange thing is, just sort of, it might be making the story a bit too long, but one of the things I was lucky enough to say to my father, we sadly lost him in 2020 actually, but not from COVID. He was 81 and had some long-term kidney issues. But one of the things that I was lucky enough to say to him was how much I appreciate the effort he went to as a failure of school in his youth to go back and resit his then matriculation and then go to university and do a Bachelor of Science. 11 years of part-time study, as well as part-time work, as well as part-time parenting, or full-time parenting really, then put us in a position where he got a job with BHP as a metallurgist. And as a child growing up, I was exposed to all of his passion for science. So all that science stuff, I attribute to that same sort of values thread, that passion thread that comes through often from parents to kids. And then both my brother and I have found ourselves independently in the world of education, and his wife was training at that stage early in their marriage to be a teacher. So, we became, if you like, much like yourself, that first generation of the educators. But I think that we've set that up, and Steph went back and did a, not entirely mature, but as a more mature age student, not just first out of school, she's done a second degree. And proud father syndrome, I have a terminal case of it. She's now successfully employed before the end of her course by the school, one of the schools that she did her rounds with. So they came back and said, we've got an issue with a vacancy and we'd love you to fill it for the remainder of the year, even before she's actually fully qualified. This is her last year of the degree. So yeah, it's been really, and when we get on calls together, we end up talking about all this sort of stuff together. We often laugh about how this is not the normal father-child type, but she and I have a fabulous relationship and have always spoken about all sorts of things in life. And it's just
fantastic.
It's fabulous to see that she's not only taken up the career, and it's a hard career, but she's already finding some success, I think, from the values she has. So, yeah. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you can be justifiably proud, and of course, you've made a huge impact throughout your career as well, and continuing with EduSpark on a global stage. And Andrew, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And yes, I do talk a lot, as you can tell, and I love any opportunity to talk about things. We all do, but I really appreciate the opportunity and the connection with yourself. We've learned so much from you already, so looking forward to the way that this continues.
Once again, a big thank you to Andrew for being my first guest on Education Talks. If you'd like to appear on the program or reach out to me directly, please visit my website, daveict.com. See you next time on Education Talks.